welcome to round 4 of our coverage of the nationals. So this is the second day of gameplay. On the first day I scored 2.5 out of 3. I was feeling good. On the second day I was going to play the top 3 seeds in succession, so it was going to be decisive, but I was fairly well prepared. I felt okay going into it. Now this was the first round of the day. I was playing with the white pieces against FIDE master John Hasford. He was then the reigning national champion and the long-time top-rated player in the country. I think he's been the best player in the country since before I started playing chess, basically. And my games against him in general tend not to go very well. I think before this point I'd played 3. I think this was my 4th game against him. 1 rapid and the rest with classical time controls. I lost all of them. But beyond losing all of them, I lost all of them very, very badly. And for some reason against him, I just didn't play well at all. I mean, you can play well and be outplayed, but you can also lose stupidly. And yeah, my games with him tend to go that way. And unfortunately, this game wasn't any different. So I started with 1 d4. He played d5, knight f3, knight f6, and j3. I prepared to go into these Catalan type positions that I like to play from time to time. And after bishop g2, he responded with c5. I castled, he played knight c6, and then I played c4, hitting back in the center. He responded with bishop e7, trying to stay neutral, maintain the tension in the center. But here I saw a way to trade and enter a type of middle game position that was fairly okay for me. So I took c takes d, the pawn took, and here I took on c5. Usually you don't do this, but because he just played bishop e7 and he has to take back on c5 with the bishop, because he wastes that time, it's okay in these kinds of positions. And in this is all following theory, master level play. Games have gone this way. So I continued a3, which was okay. I mean to play a quick b4 and push the bishop back from there so that I can possibly develop my bishop onto b2. And basically the idea of this middle game is that you've given black an isolated d pawn, which means black has more open vowels, and black maybe can get more active pieces and can get a kinside attack. But on the flip side, he has a static weakness, and in many endgames that pawn will simply be lost, and there's going to be a liability. So it's a double-edged kind of position. But the twist is that here I play with a fianchettoed kinside, which is notoriously more difficult to attack. Usually when you get into IQ piece like this, it's like a normal kinside with the pawns flat. But generally when you have a bishop in the middle, then knights here, because the pieces are generally around, they can be more difficult to attack. So it's slightly more difficult for you to get any sort of kinside attack going here as black. Whereas on the other hand, I will always have this d pawn to play against. So I thought this was a fairly okay position. He castled, I played b4. The bishop pushed back to e7. I play bishop b2. And here, usually when you're playing against the isolated pawn, your main idea is to control the square that is in front of it. So you prevent it from pushing. You basically blockade it. You try and exchange off some pieces, and then you target the pawn with your heavy pieces. That's the general game plan. So he went knight e4. Like I mentioned, he gets nice outputs for his squares in exchange for the isolated pawn. I played knight bd2. And he played bishop f5. Now this was where the game deviated from known theory games that have been played by masters. Up until here, this was following how many games? There are still 6 games that have reached this position from master level players. Most of them played the move bishop f6, and one of them played the move bishop e6. That's what went for bishop f5. Also decent, looking to back up that knight here on e4. Now, how do I play here? In general, when you're playing against the IQP, you don't particularly mind piece exchanges because, like I mentioned, you tend to be better in many endgames. But you're very particular about the kind of exchanges that you allow. You never allow exchanges that let your opponent trade that pawn away. So, for example, if you can take here and he has the option of taking with the e pawn, you tend not to allow that. I don't know if here in particular he can. It might not be good. But if he can do that successfully, then you don't want him to to trade off that isolated pawn. So here I avoided the exchange. I went knight b3, just adding another pawn, another piece to the control of the d4 square. He went bishop f6. And like I mentioned, piece trades I don't particularly mind. So I took on f6, and then the knight took back. And then I planted my knight in on d4. And I have a fine position out of the opening. He played bishop e4 to try and neutralize my bishop on g2. And this is where I started to go wrong. So here, it's still a fine position. I mean, white is doing better. The computer points out something computery, that isn't very easy to think of as a human, and that's the idea of taking on c6. I mean, not that in itself, but after the pawn takes back, the move bishop h3 is actually quite good, and once you see it, it makes sense, but it's so unnatural. It's difficult to see. The point is that you're going to play rook c1, you're going to attack the c pawn, and the bishop is more active here than it was on g2. At least it avoids being exchanged. But more important, it stops the rook from coming to c8. It's very simple and straightforward, but you quickly realize that with the rook on c3, you can double rooks, you can add your queen to the attack of the c pawn. Once this rook cannot join the defense on c8, that pawn is going to fall. The pawn can never advance because the knight controls the c5 square. So it's a very concrete idea that I didn't see. What I came up with was f3. Just avoiding the exchange, forcing his bishop to drop back. It's a move that you can play in certain structures, but in retrospect, I think in this particular structure, it's not that good. Usually, when you play f3 like this, the idea is that, of course, you want to preserve your strong bishop, but eventually, you want the move f3 to support a push e4, which in certain structures is good. But here, like I mentioned, the last thing we want to do is trade off this isolated d pawn. So the last thing I want to do is to play the move e4. So the move f3 doesn't make all that much sense here in this particular position, because if you are not planning to play e4 and open up the diagonal once again, then the move f3 doesn't make too much sense. So he played bishop g6. I played rook ac1. And this was my last opportunity to try and cash in on the structural advantage that I had. And I had to take on c6 here. And after he took back, then I continue with rook c1. And although here he can play rook c8, it's still a very good position for me. My knight can sit here or here. I can double rooks and just attack these two pawns till the end of time. I played rook c1, thinking I'm doing something similar, but just gaining time on the knight. But what I missed was this square and the move knight e5. And the knight that we let live is now going to enter into this outpost here on c4, where it hits my weak pawn here on a3, restricts my pieces, is very active, is looking to jump into weak squares like e3. And yeah, basically it's not a knight that I can allow there. So I hadn't seen this. If I had, I probably would have taken on c6, but I simply didn't see it beforehand. So here I started to think maybe I'm in a bit of trouble. It's not too bad. You can sort of play around the knight. But I already decided here to go in for something that eventually lost me the game. You're going to see in a second. Here I played f4, which is an okay move, reopening the activity of my light square bishop. The knight came into c4, and the knight is hitting the pawn and also threatening e3, so it's basically a fork, and I have to lose material somehow. So before I played f4, I'd already decided that I was going to play rook c4 and give up the exchange. This was my idea. And what I thought was that after the pawn takes, I go knight e5, and these guys have a lot of pressure here. I might win that pawn. I thought I was definitely going to win this pawn. And I have some beautiful knights in the center. I'm going to play e3 and support them. This knight might have access to this square. And I think maybe I have compensation for the piece that the exchange that I've given up, especially if this bishop can rule the diagonal like this. Yeah, I was completely wrong. He played bishop e4, which I had seen. And after bishop takes, knight takes, my calculation here was that I was going to take on c4. That was the calculation that I made beforehand, before I went for the exchange sacrifice idea. And here I thought I was just going to play this position. I didn't think I should be better, but I thought it's okay. I have a pawn for the exchange. Again, I have this fine outpost here on e5. He doesn't really want to play f6 because of this kind of stuff and this kind of stuff. So I thought this was okay. I'll just play this position. But that was a huge miscalculation. I had missed the move knight c3, and now I'm completely lost. And this is the point of knight c3. It hits the queen, and it also attacks the e2 square. So I mean, your knight is also under attack, so you have to play something like queen d2 or queen d3, and whichever one that you play, he just plays queen takes knight check. And after queen takes knight takes e2, he gets the material back, and now he's a full rook up. He's easily winning, and I'm dead lost. So this is what I missed, this knight c3 move in this position, and because of that, after knight takes e4, I cannot take back here. So it's only when we got here that I realized that, yeah, if I take the pawn on c5, on c4, I lose. And so I had to play e3 to give that knight some support, but that gave him time to play the move queen d5, and that one move changes everything. Now protects this pawn, protects that pawn. Now my knight is really just stuck there, and I have zero compensation for the exchange sacrifice, and now I'm easily lost. The computer pointed out something else that I could have played, and funny enough, when we got to this position and I realized I had lost, then thinking back on what I should have done, I realized that is what I should have gone for. In this position, instead of giving up the exchange, the move f5 would have made it it's still slightly better for black, but at least I could play on this position. It's only slightly better. After bishop h5, the knight is threatening this, so you protect against that with a move like queen e1. And your idea is that you're going to play h3 and g4, and you're going to win this piece back. And funny enough, there's very little he can do about it. So he'll win this pawn, all right, but he will still have to give up some material in exchange for it. And it's still better for black, but that was the best way for me to go. So yeah, the way the game continued, it's almost sad showing you the rest of this game. It was the equivalent of a child fighting against an adult, and the child is like flailing, trying to do something, but the adult just has him at arm's length, and it's like, what are you doing, bro? So yeah, I played queen g4 to try and set up some attack here. He played f5, pushed my queen back. My queen had to drop back to e2. He played rook a c8, threatening to push that pawn. I played rook c1 to hold that pawn down. He just started pushing. There was nothing I could do. His queen was becoming too powerful. I played queen b5 to try and exchange the queens off, with the hopes that after that my knight could attack stuff. He went in for the queen exchange, played a6. My knight came back to d4. He played rook f7. My knight is hitting this pawn, making it slightly annoying for him to double rooks here. But then he starts with rook f7. So I play rook c2 to blockade the pawn. He just played g6 to hold down the f5 pawn. I brought my king in. He brought his king in, x-raying my weak pawn on e3. I brought my king to f3. He started rerouting his knight f6. I played h3 to protect the g4 square. Then he went to d5, doubling here. I had to bring my rook to e2 to defend. He started bringing his king up. Then I brought my other knight back from the exile that it had made for itself. He pushed c2, and here it almost looks like I can take the pawn, but the idea is that my rook here becomes overworked, and so he can sacrifice. And after this, he takes here, and I'm a full piece down and I lose. So after c2, I played knight c1 to try and blockade the pawn. I mean, again, it didn't even come close to working. Rook c3, he invades, he attacks everything. And here, I did have to take. I mean, everything was hanging, this pawn, that pawn. So I had to take on c2 and try and pretend like my knight here is defending against both threats. But I had already seen, and he easily quickly saw that, yeah. He doubles here on the file, and I'm dropping one of these two pieces. And the game is over. And here I resigned. So yeah, what to say? Horrible game. Um, very disappointed having to show you this, but yeah, sometimes I mean, I would be happy if, like I mentioned earlier, if I if I got outplayed somehow, right? If we played a tight game, I and he had to show his class to win. But it's almost like whenever I played against him, I would just hand him wins on a silver platter like I did. I mean, going in for the exchange was completely uncalled for, and there is absolutely no reason why, from this position, in less than 3 moves, you should be losing as white. But yeah, it happens, and that was round four. So I lost a really bad game, and it was an annoying setback. But I still had two very tough games to play that day against the second and the third seed, so I had to quickly try and forget about it and prepare for the next game where I'll see you, and hopefully to be a more cheerful game than this one. So yeah, thank you very much for tuning in. Drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't. Enjoy your chess. Catch you in round 5.